A coin that was once pure silver was now 95% worthless metal with a thin silver coating. Think about what that meant. If you were a Roman soldier in 265 AD, receiving your pay in denarii, you were essentially being paid in coins worth a tiny fraction of what soldiers had earned just 2 centuries earlier. The government, of course, insisted that nothing had changed. The coins still bore the name denarius. They still featured the emperor's face. But the purchasing power had collapsed. Prices exploded. What cost 1 denarius in 200 AD cost a staggering 50 denarii by 300 AD. Farmers stopped selling their food for coins and demanded goods in return, preferring to barter. Soldiers refused to fight unless they were paid in gold or valuable goods. Tax collectors found it impossible to collect taxes because the currency had become worthless. The entire economic system ground to a halt. And here's the crucial point. This wasn't triggered by a foreign invasion. Rome's borders were still being defended. It wasn't caused by a plague or some other natural disaster. This was entirely self-inflicted. The Roman government deliberately destroyed its own currency to finance spending it simply couldn't afford. And when the currency died, the empire died along with it. By 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire officially collapsed. Not because Germanic tribes were inherently stronger, but because Rome could no longer afford to pay its armies, couldn't fund its administration, couldn't maintain its essential infrastructure. The currency had been debased into irrelevance, and everything built upon that currency crumbled along with it. The pattern is clear: military expansion, unsustainable spending, currency debasement, inflation, loss of economic function, and ultimately collapse. Rome tragically demonstrated this pattern. And every empire since has, in one way or another, repeated it. Now, let's fast forward 12 centuries to Spain in the 1500s. The Spanish Empire is just beginning its golden age. Christopher Columbus has opened up the New World. Hernán Cortés has conquered the Aztecs. Francisco Pizarro has conquered the Incas. And Spain now controls the richest territories on the planet. In 1545, Spanish explorers discovered the Cerro Rico mountain in Potosí, which is now Bolivia. This wasn't just another silver mine. It was the largest silver deposit ever discovered. For the next century, Potosí would produce nearly half of the world's silver, millions upon millions of pounds of it. Ships laden with silver crossed the Atlantic, filling Spanish coffers with wealth beyond imagination. Spain minted the silver into coins. The Spanish dollar became the first true global currency. It was used everywhere from Europe to Asia. It was trusted. It was pure. And there seemed to be an endless supply of it. Spain became the richest, most powerful empire on earth. At its peak, the Spanish Empire controlled territories on every inhabited continent. The sun truly never set on Spanish holdings. And then, just like Rome, they set about destroying themselves. There's a strange paradox when it comes to money. More money doesn't necessarily make you richer, especially if everyone else also has more money. When Spain flooded Europe with silver, prices rose dramatically. What cost 1 silver coin in 1500 cost 10 coins by 1600. The silver hadn't become less pure. There was simply vastly more of it in circulation. That's inflation. Spain was importing so much silver that it was destroying the value of silver itself. And even worse, Spain wasn't actually producing anything of value. They weren't building industries. They weren't innovating. They were simply extracting wealth from their colonies and spending it on wars, lavish palaces, and luxury goods imported from other countries. The silver flowed in from the Americas and flowed right back out to France, England, and the Netherlands, all to pay for goods Spain couldn't produce themselves. By the late 1500s, Spain's kings were drowning in debt. King Philip II, who ruled from 1556 to 1598, inherited massive debt from his father, Charles V, 36 million ducats in debt. And rather than cutting spending, Philip borrowed even more. He fought wars on multiple fronts, against the Ottoman Empire, against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, and against England. And when the debt became unsustainable, he simply defaulted. In 1557, Philip II declared bankruptcy and suspended all debt payments. This was the first sovereign default in modern history. But it wouldn't be the last. Spain defaulted again in 1560, again in 1575, and again in 1596, for defaults in just 40 years. Despite controlling half the world's silver production, Spain simply couldn't pay its debts. Each default eroded trust. Lenders became increasingly reluctant to lend to Spain. Interest rates on Spanish debts skyrocketed, and the government responded by further debasing the currency. They started minting coins with less silver. They even introduced copper coins that were supposed to be worth just as much as silver coins, but nobody believed it. The currency lost all credibility. By the 1600s, Spain was in terminal decline. The military couldn't be adequately funded. The colonies began to break away. And when the 30 Years' War ended in 1648, Spain signed the Peace of Westphalia, which marked the beginning of the end. By 1700, the Spanish Empire was essentially over. The country that had once controlled the world's wealth had spent and borrowed itself into irrelevance. The pattern repeats itself: massive wealth influx, government overspending, excessive borrowing, currency inflation, repeated defaults, loss of confidence, and collapse. Spain proved that even seemingly endless resources can't save an empire from fiscal mismanagement. Now we turn to Britain, the empire that lasted longer, stretched further, and controlled more wealth than Rome or Spain ever did. At its peak in 1922, the British Empire governed 458 million people, a quarter of the world's population, and controlled a quarter of the world's land. The sun never set on the British Empire, not simply because they controlled every time zone, but because they controlled so much territory that it was always daytime, somewhere under British rule. And the foundation of it all was the British pound sterling. For over 2 centuries, the pound was the world's reserve currency. Over 60% of global trade was invoiced in pounds. The gold standard anchored everything. 1 pound sterling could be exchanged for a fixed amount of gold. This created trust, stability, and ultimately, power. But empires are built on credit, and credit always has to be repaid. Britain funded its empire through borrowing, issuing government bonds, debt to finance wars, colonies, infrastructure, and its vast administration. As long as the pound maintained its value, this system worked relatively well. But then came World War I. In 1914, Britain's national debt stood at $650 million. By 1919, after 4 years of total war, it had exploded to over $7 billion. That's a tenfold increase in just 5 years. To fund the war, Britain had borrowed from everyone, from its own citizens, from the United States, from anyone who would lend them money. But the war also forced Britain to abandon the gold standard. In 1914, when war broke out, the government suspended gold convertibility. They had to print money to finance the war effort. They simply couldn't maintain gold backing while doing so. The pound became a fiat currency, backed by nothing but the government's promise. After the war, Britain desperately tried to return to gold. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, put Britain back on the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. This was a catastrophic mistake. The pound was now overvalued. British exports became uncompetitive. Unemployment soared. And the government had to maintain high interest rates to defend the currency, which further crushed economic growth. By 1931, Britain was forced off the gold standard again, this time permanently. The pound was devalued, and trust in British currency began to erode. But the real destruction came after World War II. Britain entered World War II already deeply in debt. The war essentially cost them everything. By 1945, Britain's national debt had reached a staggering 270% of its GDP. The empire had essentially bankrupted itself to win the war. Entire cities lay in ruins. The economy was shattered. And Britain owed massive debts to the United States. In 1944, while the war was still raging, the Bretton Woods Conference redesigned the global financial system. The British pound was officially replaced as the world's primary reserve currency. The US dollar took its place. Britain fought desperately to preserve the pound's status, but it was ultimately over. They had the debt, but they no longer possessed the gold or the economic strength to back their currency. What followed was a slow, humiliating decline. In 1947, Britain attempted to make the pound convertible again. The experiment lasted only 6 weeks before a run on the currency forced them to reimpose controls. In 1949, the pound was devalued by 30%. In 1967, it was devalued again. Each devaluation wiped out savings, crushed confidence, and signaled to the world that Britain was no longer a first-rate power. Meanwhile, the empire began to disintegrate. India gained independence in 1947. Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956. And Britain's military response was a humiliating failure. Colony after colony broke away, not because they were conquered by outside forces, but because Britain could no longer afford to maintain them. By the 1970s, Britain was on the verge of becoming a failed state. Inflation soared to 25%. The government went begging to the IMF for a bailout. The pound, which had once been the world's reserve currency, was now a symbol of decline. The empire that had controlled a quarter of the earth had lost it all within a mere 30 years, not through military defeat, but through currency collapse and crippling debt. The pattern repeats itself once more. War debt, currency debasement, loss of reserve status, devaluation, inflation, and imperial collapse. Britain proved that even the strongest empire can fall within a single generation when its currency fails. Which brings us to the present day. The United States, the current empire, the current reserve currency. And every single warning sign that destroyed Rome, Spain, and Britain is flashing bright red. Let's begin with the currency. The US dollar has been the world's reserve currency since 1944. After World War II, the Bretton Woods system established the dollar as the global standard. It was backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Other nations pegged their currencies to the dollar, and the dollar was considered to be as good as gold, literally. But just like Rome, just like Britain, the United States began spending far more than it had coming in. The Vietnam War, the Great Society programs, the maintenance of hundreds of military bases around the world, the costs kept escalating. By the 1960s, foreign governments started to notice that America was printing more dollars than it had gold to back them. France, under Charles de Gaulle, began demanding gold in exchange for dollars. Other nations soon followed suit. The gold was rapidly leaving Fort Knox. The bluff was being called. In 1971, President Nixon closed the gold window. No more gold backing. The dollar became a pure fiat currency, just like the debased Roman denarius, just like the pound after 1931, backed by nothing but trust and the government's promise. At first, everything seemed to be fine. The petrodollar system, established in the 1970s, created artificial demand for dollars because oil was priced in dollars globally. But the spending never stopped. The debt kept growing. In 1980, the U.S. national debt was $900 billion. By 2000, it had reached $6 trillion. By 2020, it was a staggering $27 trillion. Today, in 2025, it's over $36 trillion. That's a 40-fold increase in just 45 years, and the rate is accelerating. But the debt is only part of the story. Like Rome debasing the denarius, like Spain flooding the world with silver, the United States is actively printing money. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has created trillions of dollars out of thin air. They call it quantitative easing and claim it's necessary to stabilize the economy. During COVID, they printed over $4 trillion in just 2 years, more money than had been created in the entire previous century combined. And just like every empire before, they assured us that it wouldn't cause inflation, that modern economics had somehow solved the old problems, that we were different. We're not. Inflation hit 9% in 2022. Real inflation, the prices you actually pay for food, housing, and healthcare, is far higher. The dollar is being debased, slowly at first, but the pattern always accelerates. And just like Britain, the United States is losing its reserve currency status. In 2000, over 70% of global reserves were held in dollars. Today, it's only 58% and falling. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their new members are actively building alternatives. They're trading in local currencies, creating new payment systems, and reducing their dependence on the dollar. China and Russia are buying gold aggressively. Central banks worldwide are diversifying away from the dollar. The world is preparing for the dollar to lose its dominance, just as they prepared for the pound to fall. The pattern is unmistakable. And here's the most dangerous part. The United States faces the same problem that Rome did: military overextension. The U.S. maintains nearly 800 military bases in over 70 countries. The defense budget is over $800 billion annually. Wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have cost over $8 trillion. The empire is incredibly expensive, and it's being funded with debt and newly printed money. Just as Rome couldn't pay its legions in valuable coins, just as Spain couldn't fund its military after repeated defaults, just as Britain couldn't maintain its empire after its currency collapsed, the United States is rapidly running out of time. So, let's clearly identify the pattern, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every empire that has collapsed economically has followed the same sequence, not just a similar sequence, but an identical one. Stage 1: Dominance. The empire is at its peak, characterized by military strength, economic power, and currency trust. Rome with the denarius, Spain with the dollar, Britain with the pound, and America with the dollar. At this stage, the currency is backed by something tangible, whether it's gold, silver, or simply trust built over generations. The empire appears to be invincible. Stage 2: Overextension. The empire expands beyond its means, acquiring more territory, taking on more military commitments, and making more promises to its citizens. Rome expanded across 3 continents. Spain attempted to control every ocean. Britain colonized a quarter of the world. America maintains military bases on every continent. The costs become unsustainable. Stage 3: Deficit spending. The empire spends more than it earns. At first, this is manageable. They borrow money, issue bonds, and promise to repay. But the deficits become structural, permanent. Rome needed to pay its legions. Spain needed to finance its constant wars. Britain needed to finance 2 devastating world wars. America runs trillion-dollar deficits annually, even during periods of economic growth. Stage 4: Currency debasement. The empire can't borrow enough money and can't raise enough taxes, so they resort to debasing the currency. Rome reduced the silver content in the denarius. Spain flooded the market with silver, causing rampant inflation. Britain abandoned the gold standard and devalued the pound twice. America abandoned the gold standard in 1971 and has been printing money ever since. Stage 5: Inflation. More currency chasing the same amount of real goods inevitably means that prices rise. Rome saw prices increase 50-fold. Spain experienced significant price inflation across Europe. Britain saw inflation reach 25% in the 1970s. America is currently experiencing inflation, despite government claims that it's only transitory. Stage 6: Loss of confidence. Both the domestic population and foreign nations lose trust in the currency. Roman soldiers demanded payment in gold, not denarii. Spanish creditors refused to lend money after repeated defaults. The world shifted from pounds to dollars at Bretton Woods. Today, nations are actively shifting away from the dollar. Stage 7: Collapse. The economic system fails. The currency becomes worthless or loses its dominance. The empire can no longer afford to fund its military or maintain control. Rome fell to Germanic tribes because it could no longer afford to pay its soldiers. Spain declined into irrelevance. Britain lost its empire within decades. And the US? That's the question we're living through right now. That's the pattern. 7 stages, repeated 4 times across 2,000 years. Different empires, different continents, different currencies, but the exact same sequence of events. Because the underlying math never changes. You simply cannot spend more than you earn indefinitely. You cannot print your way to prosperity. And you cannot debase your currency without facing severe consequences. The pattern is absolute. And we're currently in stage 5, heading rapidly towards stage 6. So, what happens next? History offers us 3 possible outcomes. First, a controlled decline. This is what happened to Britain after 1945. They lost their empire, lost their reserve currency status, and experienced painful devaluations and inflation. But the country didn't simply disappear. It adjusted to being a second-tier power. It was a slow, humiliating decline, but not a total collapse. Second, a chaotic collapse. This is what happened to Rome in the 5th century. The currency became essentially worthless. The government lost control. The empire fragmented. A dark age followed. This is the worst-case scenario, a complete systemic breakdown, encompassing not just economic, but social and political spheres as well. Third, a reset and restructuring. A new currency system is established, potentially backed by gold once again. Perhaps a new reserve currency emerges, such as China's yuan, a basket of currencies, or even digital currencies. The old system dies, but something new replaces it relatively quickly. It's painful, but ultimately survivable. The United States is currently at this crossroads. The debt simply cannot be repaid, not at its current levels and not with current spending patterns. The only options are default, continued inflation, or a fundamental restructuring. Default would instantly destroy the dollar's global dominance. Inflation is already happening and will likely accelerate. Restructuring requires a level of political will that simply doesn't exist right now. And here's what makes this situation different from Rome, Spain, or Britain. Those were regional empires. The US dollar is the global reserve currency. When the Roman denarius collapsed, it primarily affected the Roman Empire. When the dollar collapses, it will affect the entire world. Every central bank, every trade agreement, every financial market, the interconnected global economy amplifies both the impact and the potential chaos. But the historical pattern says it's coming, not because of some sort of crystal ball prediction, but because of established precedent. For empires, for currency collapses, for identical sequences of events. The math of empire is unforgiving. You can delay it. You can deny it. But you cannot ultimately avoid it. Rome debased its currency to pay its legions. The denarius died. The empire fell. Spain flooded the world with silver. Inflation destroyed its wealth. The empire declined. Britain borrowed heavily to fight 2 world wars. The pound collapsed. The empire dissolved. And now, the United States prints trillions, runs endless deficits, and believes that it's somehow different. It's not different. The pattern doesn't care about American exceptionalism. It doesn't care about military strength or technological advancement. The pattern is fundamentally economic, and economic laws are as absolute as physical laws. You cannot print wealth. You cannot borrow indefinitely. And you cannot debase your currency without ultimately destroying your empire. For empires, for collapses, for identical patterns. The only remaining question is timing. How long until stage 6, the loss of confidence? How long until the world loses faith in the dollar? How long until the American empire follows Rome, Spain, and Britain into the history books? The pattern suggests we're close. The staggering debt suggests we're close. The relentless money printing suggests we're close. And history, which has witnessed this exact sequence destroy 4 empires before, suggests that the ending is inevitable. The only variables are how quickly it happens and how painful it will be. If this perspective has resonated with you, consider subscribing. When the pattern completes, you'll want to understand what happened and, more importantly, why. History holds the answers, and the pattern never lies. History reveals a recurring pattern that has led to the downfall of every major empire. It's not about being conquered, invaded, or even revolution. It's not about economic collapse in general, but a very specific type: currency collapse. And the truly unsettling thing is that it plays out the same way every single time. Think about Rome, the empire that dominated the known world for half a millennium. Its collapse coincided with its currency becoming essentially worthless. Then there's Spain, which controlled more gold and silver than any other nation in history, yet still went bankrupt repeatedly until its vast empire simply dissolved. And what about Britain, which was the undisputed master of global trade for 2 centuries? It lost its empire within a decade after its currency took a nosedive. For times in recorded history, a dominant empire has followed this precise, chilling pattern. Military overreach, unsustainable spending, currency debasement, or, in modern terms, rampant money printing, inflation, a loss of confidence, and then, ultimately, collapse. And in each and every instance, those in power were convinced that they were somehow different, that their empire was special, that the age-old rules simply didn't apply to them. They were always proven wrong. Right now, in 2025, the United States is following that exact same pattern step by step, with each warning sign flashing just as they did before. The only question is whether we're at the beginning, somewhere in the middle, or nearing the end of this cycle. This is the story of how empires destroy themselves from within, through their own currency. We'll look at how it happened to Rome, Spain, and Britain, and why every single indicator suggests it's happening again right here, right now. Let's start with Rome, the empire that controlled Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East for over 500 years. At its height, Rome governed 60 million people spread across 3 continents. Its military was unmatched in its power and reach. Its infrastructure was the most advanced the world had ever seen. And its currency, the denarius, was trusted everywhere, from the far reaches of Britain to the ancient lands of Egypt. The denarius was a silver coin, first introduced way back in 211 BC. It contained approximately 4.5 grams of pure silver. For centuries, it maintained its value because the Roman government meticulously maintained its purity. When you received a denarius, you knew exactly what you were getting. Pure silver, real value. This fostered trust, and that trust allowed Rome to finance its expansion, pay its soldiers, and construct its incredible infrastructure. But empires are incredibly expensive to maintain. With each passing generation, Rome's borders expanded further and further. Every expansion demanded more soldiers, more forts, more roads, more administrative overhead, and ultimately, more money than Rome actually possessed. So, they resorted to what every empire does when it spends more than it earns. They debased the currency. Emperor Nero, who ruled from 54 to 68 AD, was the first to significantly reduce the silver content of the denarius. He needed to fund his extravagant lifestyle and his costly military campaigns. So, he ordered the mints to reduce the silver content from 100% to 90%. That extra 10% translated into pure profit for the emperor. He could mint 11 coins with the silver that used to make only 10, effectively putting more coins into circulation using the same amount of silver. That's inflation, plain and simple. But even at 90% silver, the denarius still held substantial value. The real destruction came later, under subsequent emperors. By the time Emperor Caracalla ruled in 211 AD, the denarius was down to just 50% silver. Half of its value was real, the other half was just base metal. By 265 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, it had plummeted to a mere 5% silver.